Soyica Diggs Colbert, congratulations on this amazing book, right? Radical Vision, a Biography of Lorraine Hansberry, a winner of ATHE's Outstanding Book Award. It's a for those who have not read this book yet, it's tremendous, it's amazing, it's a must read. It's like, have it on your bookshelf, buy it for a friend, gift it for the holidays, all the holidays. It's worth having and reading again and again. And then for those who teach, assigning it to students and sharing with everyone else A question I have for you to launch this is, what inspired you to write a biography of Lorraine Hansberry?
So I like to give people flowers, and Maurice Wallace, who's a faculty member at Rutgers University, I was on a panel with him right after I finished Black Movements, and I told him I had two book ideas, one to write this biography of Hansberry and another one on the Harlem Renaissance, and he was like, write the Hansberry book, apply for a fellowship at the Schomburg, I'll support you. And I did it. And it was sort of last minute when I applied for the fellowship, but I ended up getting it. And I sort of saw that as a sign that this was a book I needed to write. And I will also say, in my naivete, as with, I think, the general public, I did not realize how prolific Hansberry was because so little of her work has been published. And so when I got to the Schomburg, which is where her papers are held, I was overwhelmed by the volume of work, and it really changed the project.
Now, and in the book, you open it by looking at the significance of March 10th across 3 different sort of years as sort of signals and sort of perhaps shifts in Hansberry's life. So, without sort of, asking you to name the dates, per se, but the events that occurred, what were those events, and how did Hansberry's life change in response to those events that occurred across different years on March 10th?
Yeah, so I opened the book. The March 10ths are Raisin and the Sun opened, which changed Hansberry's life for obvious reason. Her father died, so that was the first March 10th. Daddy died, Raisin opened, and I got a divorce, all on March 10th. And so Hansberry's father and mother were both civil rights activists and were, what we might consider a power couple in our contemporary context. And they really taught her a lot about how to fight for freedom. And so losing her father as a teenager had an indelible impact on her life. She says later on in a speech later on in her life that racism helped kill him. And so she really thinks about how the structural context of our world informed her father's premature death. And then, Raisin opening both has an impact on her career, obviously, but she also writes a lot about how it turns her into a celebrity and informs her ability to move in the world in ways that she finds both important, but then also limiting, and how it sort of isolates her. And so she meditates a lot in her private writing about the impact of Raisin and her ability to move in the world as an organizer, as an activist. And then finally getting a divorce, I say to my students, and the people when I talk about the book, getting divorced in our 21st century context, although painful, is pretty regular, mundane, something that many people have experienced. But Hansberry came of age at a time when marriage was at its height in the United States, the highest marriage rates in our country's history. And so for her as a queer Black woman who wasn't publicly known as being queer, she'd identify as a lesbian, getting divorced was also a really important moment in her trajectory.
And in the book, you mention this, and you write about in wonderful detail, and it's quite engaging, the conversations, the influence that James Baldwin had on the life of Lorraine Hansberry, and also her influence on Baldwin as well. So could you tell us a bit more about this unique dynamic of the Baldwin-Hansberry sort of friendship, conversation, sort of mutual spheres of influence?
Oh, I love their relationship. I hope that I have a friend who could write about me the way that Baldwin writes about Hansberry in the essay Sweet Lorraine. Based on the archive, both in his papers as well as hers, you can really see that they had an intimate understanding of one another. So both are young writers, both spend significant time in the village. Of course, Baldwin is going back and forth to France, but he sees the village as one of his 2 homes. Both are queer, Black activists. And so when Hansberry is with Baldwin, it's one of the rare moments where I think she could express the fullness of who she was, and he could express the fullness of who he was. Because most of the time in the groups they're in, there's parts of themselves that are different, right? They're in some ways different from the majority of the group. And so Baldwin tells this lovely story about how, you know, he and Hansberry would get into these debates and you would think that they were, you know, falling out. And at the end, she would just laugh and say, "Oh, Jimmy," and then, you know, they would walk off. And so, you know, and you get some of that spirit in the live tapings of the recordings of conversation they've had as well.
That's, yeah, I just love how it's threaded so sort of wonderfully, engagingly well, like, you know, throughout the book, you know, and how they reflect one another, and they sort of they push each other, and I love that. I have one more question for you, and that is, so how should we think about Lorraine Hansberry's legacy in this moment in time, right? So, you know, we're familiar with the standard narrative often of, you know, along came Raisin and in 59, right? And then it shifted things way into the 60s and there forward. And certainly that is a huge, massive part, but there's something about her as an activist and her politics and how she wrote about herself and her identity that expands beyond the conventional, right? So what is the legacy, you know, of Lorraine Hansberry in 2023 or 2022?
2023.
2023, but I'm looking forward, yeah.
I would say that, you know, for me, writing this book, I never anticipated that the book would come out during a pandemic. But I realized what a gift it was to be able to engage with Hansberry's papers. I'm grateful for all of the executors of her estate over time who, you know, did such a good job of compiling and keeping her work. Because one of the things that I realized is that Hansberry was writing in a moment of multiple crises as we are experiencing in our world right now. And she really gives a blueprint for how to work towards a more expansive understanding of freedom as you are working, as there are multiple crises in your world. And so that's why in the introduction, I talk about a speech she gave during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I want to draw awareness to what's happening internationally, domestically, and artistically as her work is unfolding. Hansberry wrote a play called What Use Are Flowers, which is about, you know, dystopian worldview. She was very aware of what was happening throughout the world and was writing towards it. And so I would say the one thing that people take away from the book and how it can help us in our current moment is that Hansberry was a builder and an organizer. And she understood that great advancements in freedom happen over time, right? So they were prepared for over time, that there was a foundation laid for their possibility over time. And that the moments of retraction were also structured and built over time. And so, and I think she learned this because growing up in the 40s and the 50s, she saw her parents doing this work.
Yes.
And so when, you know, the Civil Rights Bill is passed, when the March on Washington happens, Hansberry has seen the infrastructure that is built up to these moments. And so I think that for me, at least, that gives me some hope that even though the work we're doing right now may not seem to be bearing fruit, or maybe it does seem to be bearing fruit, there is a sense that even if it's not bearing fruit in the moment, it's still important and necessary to eventually bear fruit. And so I was telling my husband that this year for me is a year of planting seeds, because you can't always have everything blooming. There has to be a moment where you're planting and tilling the soil. And that's something that Hansberry has taught me. And I think in a time where there's a lot of concerning things happening in our world, having her archive is a real gift.
Oh, geez, that's so well stated. You know, Soyica, thank you again so much for this conversation, for the gift that you created for us, which is the Radical Vision. Again, everyone should check this book out. Like, buy it, own it, share it, give it. Thank you.